Really happy to be hosting this webinar with Zero Carbon Harrogate tonight. A few housekeeping rules. If you could just pop yourself on mute during the presentations, and then you can unmute yourself at the end when we're going through the Q&A period. Feel free to leave your cameras on if you like. It is always nice to see a face. And you can also pop any questions that you have in the chat box if they sort of crop up during the talk. But I will pass you over to John.
Hello, my name is John Kerr. I'm the Retrofit Program Manager for Zero Carbon Harrogate. For those that don't know, Zero Carbon Harrogate is a charity based in Harrogate, looking at reducing carbon emissions in the Harrogate area or district. My role, obviously, Retrofit Program Manager, as it says, primarily looking at how we stimulate the retrofit market in terms of upskilling the construction industry, which is part of what we're doing today, along with a number of other trades training, as well as trying to inform homeowners about retrofit. So today is the second of two webinars. Obviously, as the title suggests, understanding retrofit performance targets. Hopefully you'll find it interesting. We'd very much like your feedback on this, and please get involved in the chat to any feedback on that, and what we can do to improve, and future training courses that we will be able to offer. Thank you for being here. Right, okay.
Okay, so
I can hand you over to Diane.
okay, good evening. So this evening's topics, understanding retrofit performance targets. So we've got three topics that we're covering. Retrofit for the targets themselves, and how the targets are measured, and then looking at other considerations that need to be made with retrofit performance. My name's Diane Hubbard, and my business name is Greenfoot Decks. To give you a bit of background first before I start, I'm particularly interested in pre-1900 houses, and that's my academic research area. I've sort of got quite a lot of experience with new build as well, and I'm a passive house consultant. So I get involved in things like ventilation and building testing. So my experience is practical, but more on the testing and verification side of it. So this is the slant that I've put on this evening's presentation. So before I start, what I'd really like to emphasize is not so much the specific targets, but the thing I see most when I test buildings is that when things go wrong, quite a lot of the time, the problems are down to maybe a lack of clarity of what the objective is, and a means of verifying whether you've actually got there or not. So it's a really difficult situation when, I say come in to test a building and the client has an expectation of what they're after, and maybe the contractor isn't clear about what was wanted, or maybe the professionals supporting the project are not clear about it. So whatever standard you're looking at trying to improve your home to, the thing is to be really clear about what you're trying to do. You need to personally be really clear about what the objectives are, and also verifying whether you've got there or not, or whether you're going to get there, because that will give you a sense of satisfaction when you do it, but also it provides accountability to whoever is supporting you. They need to know that you've got this clear objective and it's going to be checked. And that really helps to focus people's minds when you're trying to determine whether things are going to be achieved. Because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is cut energy use and to save carbon. So you also need to have a really clear plan as to how you're actually going to do it. So, and it really does need to be more than a vague sort of cunning plan. The important things to emphasize are it's got to be holistic. I come across quite a lot of retrofits where people are focused on one thing, and maybe by not looking at the other things, you're restricting how well the building's going to perform. So the most common thing that I come across is people putting quite a lot of insulation into a building and paying no attention to the airtightness of it. Now, the issues that creates is that if you can spend quite a lot on insulation, but actually the performance of the insulation is affected by air moving through it or moving around it, thermal bypass. So you may not achieve, by not looking at airtightness, you may not achieve anywhere near the performance of the building that you're expecting. So you have to look at airtightness alongside the thermal performance. And you've also got to look at ventilation, because the last thing you want is to end up with a moisture problem, either within the building fabric or within the property. So you have to look at it as a whole, whatever standard that you're going to, and to whatever standard is appropriate for the level that you're trying to take the building to. You've got to clearly communicate your targets, all involved. Now, that's not just the contractor, that's making sure if you're using a building designer, an architect or an architectural technician, that they're clear about what's required. Again, I've been in some quite difficult situations where the client is very clear about what they're looking for, but it's not been, the architect has maybe understood it in a different way. If you use just terms, vague terms, they can be interpreted differently. So one of the great strengths of doing sort of analysis, maybe along the lines, if you're looking at a deep retrofit, along the lines of using the passive house software, we're not talking about the building having to be passive house standard, but along those lines, it really helps in terms of clarity, because you're putting numbers on things, and having a number there means it's less prone to misinterpretation. So being really clear about the targets is very important. And you need to make sure that you're technically supported to the right standard that you're trying to work to. So what I'm talking about there is, if you're just bunging some insulation in a loft, that's clearly a low risk situation. But if you're looking at, say, an older building which hasn't got a damp, which doesn't have a DPC, maybe there's moisture in the, so there's potential for moisture within the walls, you've got to be more careful about the detailing of it. If you're trying to get a building that's very airtight, you need support to do that, or you need the technical ability yourself to do it. So I'm not necessarily saying go out and you know, hire a host of professionals. I'm just saying it needs to be supported in a way that's to the right level for what you're actually trying to achieve with the building. So the plan is really, really important. Okay, so on to standards then. So the sort of key standards we're talking about, I've only got 15 minutes here to go over this, right? So I could go into a lot of numbers, but what I want to do is to really highlight the relevant things. If you are doing stuff to more than a quarter of your building, you need to comply to building regs, okay? And the way that that's specified for existing elements, we'll assume you're not putting an extension or anything on, you're purely working within the current building. There's a prescribed U values that you've got to achieve. That's the first thing. So if you're doing something that's a reasonably significant retrofit, you have got to comply to building regs that's appropriate for an existing building. The other things I'm going to talk about, they're not compulsory. These are, you know, you are looking at what is relevant for you, what's relevant for your budget. I mean, at the end of the day, there's no compulsion to work to any standard that's here. You can do your own thing, you know, that works within, you know, the capital and the effort that you want to put within your building. They're just useful benchmarks to think about. So at sort of the top end of everything is Retrofit, which is the passive house retrofit standard. Now, I'm assuming well, I don't know. Can I ask my audience who they are? Can I just break off for a minute? Who have I actually got in my audience to check? Can you come on to? There aren't many of you, so you can tell me who you are.
Hi, my name's Simeon. I run a charity working particularly social housing landlords in Yorkshire to support them on retrofit and revolution stroke journey with an aim of maximising employment and skills into the sector, and also practically providing energy advice with a focus on social landlords, as opposed to going head to head with another well-known charitable organisation that provides it, particularly in the private sector.
Okay. And who else is there?
Hello.
Hi.
Can you hear me, John?
Yes.
I'm John Conway. I'm a building surveyor, project manager, property manager. Worked across quite a lot of different organisations. Sort of recently had a stint with a local authority for about 18 months, during which I got a taste for retrofitting.
Okay.
So I'm looking to focus more on retrofitting than anything else, and I'm currently doing the retrofit coordinator course, which I'm just at the well, I'm doing module 13 out of 13, so towards the end stages of it, hopefully.
Great. Okay. And who else is there? Hi.
I'm Stephen from WTO Builders. Family business has been going over 40 years. I've got passive house tradesperson qualification. We've been doing retrofit for about 15 years. And just sort of wanting to learn a bit more as the whole Enefit. One of my big problems is Enefit. I find it really frustrating because everyone wants Enefit, and then you tell them it's like 3 times the price of anything normally. It's more expensive than a passive house, but then there's no in between of people don't seem to understand that there's massive levels between building inspector, building regs level, and then going AECB or Enefit. There's nothing. We need more guidelines to help customers with their budgets, because a lot of the time when I've worked with architects, they sort of throw the customer to one side when they haven't got the budget to fit wood fibre and everything like that.
Yeah. So are you working, when you're talking about the AECB standard, are you working to the historical AECB standard or the new revised one?
The new revised one. I've got a job hopefully in Otley coming off next year, and they wanted Enefit, and then we've told them the price of Enefit, and they didn't know about AECB. So now they're looking to see if they can afford AECB instead for the budget.
So the revised AECB standard at the 50 kilowatt hours, are you working to that, or are you working to the historical one of 40? Because there's a recognition that is that.
I was going to say, we always try and get as high as possible with whatever we're working with. If the budget will allow it, we'll try and push for that 50, turns per unit. But I think a lot of people don't appreciate like what you're on about, and I'm really happy you mentioned it. It's like it's performance gap. The biggest thing in this industry is performance gap, and no one ever seems to realise it. Like I've done my own retrofit, my own home. I'm nowhere near like even new building reg standard, but I've worked hard to make sure I've got minimum performance gap in everything, and I've shown it can be done on a lower budget, and you don't need as much insulation as people think, as long as when you're doing it, you're installing it with the performance of what the actual manufacturer says.
Yeah, I think you should do the rest of this presentation actually. Because you've just summarized basically what it's down to, that it's all down to that. Thanks very much indeed on that. Who else have we got?
I think it's me, and my name is Julia Smirnova. I'm originally from Ukraine, if you ask my accent, but I live in Sheffield for 16 years, got PhD in building sciences, in acoustics actually.
Okay.
But I'm also a retrofit assessor and energy assessor since 2014. I was doing mainly EPCs, but recently done about a year and a half, past 2035. And I have a small company. We advise homeowners, landlords, basically provide recommendations what is the first step, particularly in relation to historic buildings, because lots of people live in Victorian houses where modern materials unfortunately can only make harm.
Yes.
And I also advise on heat pumps. Lots of people interested just in is the house suitable for heat pump? The first questions they want to ask. And I work with a colleague who is an mini engineer, very knowledgeable about all heating systems, just providing people first step what they actually need.
Okay.
Really very challenging job. It's again, and I think I agree with one of the previous speakers, just costs. People don't realize even how much costs it to go into your house, do survey, do measurement, modeling. It's difficult.
If you drop me a line afterwards, I've got there's a builder in Sheffield who's currently doing an Retrofit on a terrace, sort of in reasonably central Sheffield.
Okay.
It's got a cellar as well. So yes, if you drop me a line separately. Okay.
I would love to. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Is there if your email will be in the end?
Yeah, my email is at the end. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Diane.
Okay. Have we got anybody else? Is that it? Anybody else? I think we've got somebody else, but they're on there's no microphone. So that's interesting. Hello?
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, sorry, I'm just driving at the moment, so yeah,
Okay.
that's why I'm not. Yeah, so I'll just listen in. Sorry.
Are you a builder, or are you a contractor or a householder?
An architecture designer.
Okay.
And then I am also training to be a retrofit coordinator with Retrofit Academy.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm kind of new to the retrofit environment, so I'm hoping to learn some new things and learn more and get some experience. Yeah. So yeah, that's basically me.
Great. Okay. Okay, so we've got a really interesting mix of people here. Clearly, some people have got a vast amount of experience on doing it, but I mean, the things that have come through there are, cost is, I suppose, being realistic. I mean, going back to that previous slide, being realistic about what can be achieved, because it's fine having that aspiration of Retrofit, but actually pragmatically on most buildings you're not going to get there. I think the thing to sort of emphasize is, particularly with the AECB standard, they historically they've had a standard which is 40 kilowatt hours per meter squared and an air tightness of 1.5, and they've basically split it into two standards in very recently. So we have a level 1 and a level 2 standard now, and the level 1 is in effect an entry level. We do need to recognize that actually one of the biggest contributors to the carbon from the buildings is the heating source, and so the level 1 is quite a basic standard that basically says basic energy improvements plus a change to low carbon heating, because of the need for us to cut our carbon as quickly as possible. And the fear over the standards was that actually it was stopping people from doing anything whatsoever to their buildings. So people were sort of the rabbit in headlights. We don't know what to do, so we won't do anything. So the level 1 standard has been introduced as a very basic level, but to give some sort of recognition that people are doing something. So I realise for this audience that I've got, where you're mainly professionals working within the field already, that may be less appropriate, but for a more general audience of householders, that's actually quite a useful thing. So rather than people not doing anything whatsoever, that there is recognition that there could be a standard achieved with quite a basic level. On the level 2, which is sort of the equivalent of the old standard, it's been relaxed a little bit because, again, recognizing that it's still really difficult to achieve. You know, it depends on the building that you're actually working with. So historically, you'd got to hit 40 kilowatt hours per meter squared. And it's been revised to 50 to make it more practical to achieve at a realistic cost. Also, the airtightness side of it has been relaxed a little bit from what was 1.5 if you were going for MVHR to 2 with MVHR. So it's a more relaxed standard, so more realistic. So some of those points that have come out in that brief conversation with everybody is it maybe is changing to make it more realistic. The other things to make you aware of are LETI. I don't know if you've come across the LETI, that's the London Energy Transition Initiative. They're a sort of bottom-up organisation of building professionals who are doing tremendously brilliant work, both with new build and with retrofit. And they have a whole host of documents that support people like yourselves, whether you're training for doing the carbon light training, or whether you're doing your PAS 2035 or retrofit coordinator. You've got they're really useful documents that will support you. And they use the same methodology that's behind Enefit and the AECB standard, and that's the Passive House Planning Package software. They use it in a slightly different way in that they have a different calculation method for the floor area on it. But they're using this thing called energy use intensity, which is of great value when you're thinking about trying to reduce the energy use of the building. And you can also look at the carbon side of things. So some of the work that I do, for example, I'm looking with landlords at the moment on their carbon impact, both in terms of the embodied carbon that's going into the building with the retrofit and the in-use carbon. So there you're taking into account the heating source as well as the energy use of the building. So maybe looking beyond the standards is quite important. It depends on what the driver of the client actually is as to which is most relevant. And of course, the budget. I have to say, though, and again, this, APCs came up in the conversation, the EPCs are still a real driving force for what's happening, whether you're dealing with social landlords or private landlords, but also with owner-occupiers, because they're thinking of what's going to happen to their building. Now, the problem with EPCs is that it moves. People don't appreciate that you could do an EPC 5 years ago, have not changed the building, and the EPC rating will be different now. So it's really difficult, particularly with, with private landlords, where they're looking at, well, we've got to hit a band C, how are we going to do it? Quite often you get a conflict between maybe the standards or the energy use intensity and the energy performance certificate. So that's a really difficult one to try and deal with. So you've got to understand where your client is coming from when you're talking about the performance target. So if I can put EPCs to one side, but we do need to recognise that actually they are really important to lots and lots of clients. So I've gone away from my presentation a little bit here. So I've sort of covered the next couple of slides. But I think you guys, from talking to you, you'll be pretty well aware of what the U values are with building regs. You've got to, if you're doing something to more than 25% of the building, these are the sort of levels that you're looking at having to comply to under current Part L for the existing elements of existing dwellings. So it really does depend on what your client's looking for, but you know, it's far better. You know, they're just individual elements. You have to look at this, the problem of what is happening with ventilation, what's happening with moisture within the building as well. I've covered the level 2 stuff that we're talking about for the ACB standard, but just for clarification, it's 50 kilowatt hours is the normal standard for the delivered space heating. Okay, so on to how they're measured. Now, again, because you guys are mainly building professionals, you may be aware of, I mean, we are really limited as to how we verify performance. Infrared thermography, we can use that as a standalone thing, and you may well have already just used available cameras. I don't know, John, does Zero Carbon Harrogate have a camera available for use in the area?
Not at the moment, no. It is something which I think we're considering, but at the moment, no.
There's often quite a lot of cameras around. Cameras are available easily to hire relatively cheaply. So, and I mean, I have, my mobile phone's got a thermal imaging camera on it of an okay resolution. So there's ways of sort of tackling it. The problem that you have with infrared thermography alone is you're just looking at the thermal bridges. And usually at the point when you're actually checking that, there probably isn't actually much opportunity to do something about it. Really, when you're looking at thermal bridges, that's part of the design process. The test that's really of great relevance is an airtightness test. And using thermography with the airtightness test really does highlight where the issues are within the building, because as we've already talked about, if you've got air moving through insulation, it really impacts the performance of it. The other ways that we can measure things are sort of paper-based. I mean, you know, we can confirm things with U-value calculations, and to a certain extent, those performance targets are supported by these calculations. So you've got to have, you know, calculations on thermal bridges if you're looking at the Retrofit standards. In some cases, for the ACB standard, you've got to have confirmation on levels of thermal bridges when you're looking at the level 2 standard. So U-value calculations form part of it, and the energy use intensity calculations in passive house planning package, if you're looking at the ACB standard or Retrofit, clearly an important part of it, and unfortunately so are EPCs. Okay, so I'm just going to briefly talk about what is an airtightness test, and explaining the numbers and when we should really be looking at testing a building and how to prepare for a test. So you guys, it sounds like you're all well aware of what the issues are within buildings, the key ingress points, and but the thing I'm not sure about is whether you routinely are doing, where you're not doing necessarily buildings for certification, whether you've actually had airtightness tests carried out. So what we've got on the right hand side there is a blower door test on an existing building. So what the test does is you are creating a pressure difference between inside and outside the building, and what happens then is if the pressure is lower in the building, it pulls air into the building through all of those ingress points. And by using a thermal imaging camera, you can see where those ingress points actually are. When we're talking about air tightness, we've got sort of two ways of measuring it. Our UK standard is air permeability. when we're talking about passive house standard, we tend to refer to an air change rate. So when you're talking to clients, or you need to be clear about which you're talking about, because there could be quite a big variation. So for example, yesterday I was testing actually it's a property that's being done to the AECB level 2 standard, and it's a bungalow. So bungalows have got quite a big surface area compared to the volume of them. So in that instance, there's quite a difference between those two figures. So again, being clear with clients as to which standard you're working to is really important. To the blower door test, we are excluding deliberate points of ventilation. So you have to bear in mind that when you're talking to clients about things, they bear those extra points in mind, that in reality, they are going to be affecting the energy use in the building. So I've had instances of clients wanting to retain open fires in a building where they're putting shed loads of insulation into it, and they need to understand that those open fires are going to be significantly impacting on the energy use of the building in real life when it's actually in use, but they're excluded from the air permeability test. So you need to bear that in mind. And again, when we're talking about things on a holistic basis with a client, that needs to be emphasized. Again, making sure your clients are aware of the sort of standard that we are talking about. So Enefit is achieving an air change rate of less than 1. In terms of where existing buildings are, I test quite a lot of buildings pre-retrofit. I do like a benchmarking test to enable clients to decide how they're going to spend their money wisely, because there's an assumption that older buildings, existing buildings, are leakier than they often are in reality. So people assume that they're going, a pre-1900 house might be very leaky, but actually, if it's not been messed around with much, I find about 1/3 of them come in at sort of under 10. So a benchmarking test is quite useful, particularly when there's a tight budget, because you can see where you need to put the emphasis, whether you're looking at just working with what you've got already and looking at the insulation side where you've got a good level of air tightness already, or whether it's really quite leaky. And so that's one of the things where you need to put more attention onto that. So I've got a photograph that, here's a good photograph. Okay, so you can test most things. So this is a job that I did earlier this year. This was built in 1503, right? And interestingly, the air tightness on this castle came out as substantially more airtight than the 2007 building that I tested the day before. Okay, so don't assume it's going to be that older buildings are going to be really leaky, but you can test all sorts of things. Okay, so I don't assume any of you have a castle that you want to test. I have only tested one castle. So when to test. Okay, so I mentioned pre-retrofit. I think that's a really important time to look at it, because then the client is spending their money wisely. They know where they're working from. In terms of good project management, I'm an engineer. A key thing from my point of view is you won't get where you want to get to unless you know where you're starting from. So you've got to, I would say, a pre-retrofit test is really quite important. Yeah, thermal bridges, you know where they're going to be in an existing building, but you don't know what the air tightness is going to be, because it could be like that 2007 building, where actually that was about the worst building I've ever tested. So knowing where you are, you can then draw up a plan to see where you can get to. An intermediate test is the absolutely most important one to do. So when I say an intermediate test, basically that's when you have your air tightness layer complete but nothing else done. So it's roughly first fix. By doing it at that point, you know whether you're roughly where you're going to be for the finished test, but you've still got access to things and you can carry out any remedial works easily and at minimum cost. So if you can do one test on an existing building, on a retrofit, you do an intermediate test, because you can verify at that point whether you are anywhere near where you want to be in terms of what the client's objectives are. Now, depending on what certification you're going through, you might be able to use it for certification. So, for example, with the AECB, that intermediate test, it depends on exactly where you do it, but you might be able to use it for the certification. For NFIT, you would have to do a compliance test at a later stage. But the intermediate test, if the client isn't going for any certification at all, but they've established what they want to achieve, then the intermediate test is the time to do it. It will prove to the client that you've delivered what you said you were going to do. So that's the one to do. On completion test, sorry, the on completion test. Sorry, I think I've skipped. I've got some pictures here. I've just realised. Okay, so pre-retrofit baseline test. So what the images I'm showing you here? Let me just move this. So what I've got here is some examples from pre-retrofit tests. So this is using the building's heated, and we're looking at what's happening. So what we've got here, and this top image on the right hand side, we've got a dot and dab plasterboard wall, and what we're seeing here is the air movement behind the plasterboard, bypassing any insulation that's in the wall. And you can see that where there's a light in the ceiling, and we've got insulation held off from around the light in the ceiling. So what that image is telling us is actually there is air movement there. So if you were, depending on what your target actually is, you can, that might be a problem. And you might need to address it. The one we've got at the bottom is a more straightforward issue where we've got air coming through. It's a bath panel that we're looking at there, and basically there's air coming through the where the waste pipe goes out through the wall, and we've got these bands of cold air actually coming into the bathroom around where the existing bath panel is. Intermediate test, as I say, is the most important one that we're looking at. I've just got a couple of examples here of where we've got residual leakage. Here we've got a wall floor junction where we've not got any treatment on that junction, so air is actually just leaking through. So the plaster's stopping short of the floor, and really that needs taping. Again, it depends on what standard you're actually aiming for. And we've got a loft hatch that's been missed on draft proofing, basically, in that instance. So we're seeing again the cold air being pulled around the outside of the loft hatch, just a board sitting within a frame. But it's the intermediate test is the time to actually find those things, because there'll always be something that's missed. Everybody's human. So the on-completion test is really only needed if it's for compliance. Part L if it's a new build, but for Retrofit you would need a non-completion test. But really the most important one is that intermediate test. So quickly talking about preparing for a test, you need to understand what the objectives are. So what the standard is that's being aimed for. To understand actually the test process, it's a collaborative thing. It's not a confrontational thing. When an airtightness test is carried out, it's to identify where the things are, where you know, the items that still need a little bit more work carrying out on them. And that the importance of the intermediate test is that you can snag those items at minimum cost. By having the intermediate test, it removes the stress from you as a contractor, and it avoids at a later stage the client coming back saying it's not performing, whereas actually what they're doing is just putting their heating on more. So you've got a measured point for the building. And the pre-refurb test, you know what you're working with. If you do one of those tests, you know whether it's got an air tightness of 20 or whether it's got an air tightness of 5. So you know how far you've actually got to take it. And they are my details. So are there any questions that anyone would like to ask me at this stage?
I think there was some in the chat, Diane.
Okay.
So what thermal image apps would you recommend?
Okay, thermal image apps. The problem is you do actually need a camera or a device rather than it being an app. There's some really low cost cameras available out there. As I say, my camera, my phone is when I researched them, my phone is a Doogie, and it cost me about 350, 400 quid. And it has a camera. The resolution of the camera in there is actually useful enough. It's the equivalent. The most common one that people see around is a Flare 1 Pro, which is a phone attachment. It's a separate small unit. The lower resolution Flare 1s are not as good, not really good enough to be useful from a buildings point of view. But the Flare 1 Pro is pretty good. The only problem is it's quite fragile, being it basically plugs into the socket on the phone, so it's quite fragile really. Whereas I mean this one is a builder's phone, so you can't quite throw it across the room, but the camera is of a similar resolution. I use when I'm doing surveys, I use a camera that's 240 by 320 pixels, and that's a good resolution for buildings. That should give you sort of everything that you're looking for really. So it doesn't work as an app. The apps are sort of a bit smoke and mirrors-ish. It's got to be a specific device within it. Does that answer the question? But, you know, 500 quid will get you something that will give you, you know, a basic useful level.
There's also a question, Diane says, what would be an approximate cost for an air tightness test with thermal imaging on a typical 4-bed detached house?
Okay, so I personally, I mean, other people do this. Personally, what I charge is, if it's local to me, I charge 350 quid. And if it's not so local, it's 400 quid. But it does give you a lot of information. You get a library of images from it. You get a chat with either whoever's there, whether it's you as the builder, the client, the architect. We talk through what we've found. You get an air tightness of the building to whatever standard people are looking for. So if they're looking at Retrofit, we talk about it in an Retrofit context, or if it's air permeability. So it's geared to the relevance of what the client is looking for. But it really does help. I mean, that example that I mentioned of the 2007 building, it was actually a well-known timeshare in the middle of the Lake District is probably the best way I can describe it. A reception building of a well-known timeshare in the middle of the Lake District.
In Langdale.
Sorry?
In Langdale.
Couldn't possibly comment. But they, they had it was an original house that was built. It wasn't built as a house originally, but it's used as non-domestic space, and then it's been extended twice. Once sort of in the pre-2000s, and then once in the post-2000s. And we actually separated the building into different portions because of its layout. And it's quite shocking, really, how poorly airtight the most recent portion was. So it really is, you shouldn't assume what you've got. A big difference is old buildings have wet plaster, and wet plaster is an airtightness layer. So if you've got dot and dab, or if you've got exposed stonework, you're going to get air coming through it. So you need to bear that in mind. And if you've got anything different to a box, if you've got sort of complex profiles and things joining to things, then you potentially have lots of issues. So, but if you've got something that was maybe built by a builder for his own occupation, whenever it was, it's usually pretty good in terms of airtightness, because so much is down to the care that was originally put into it. So don't assume is the thing. Don't assume, because that can be quite costly. You can end up spending money on things that don't need attention, or missing things that really do need attention. Does that answer that one?
I have a question, if I may, Diane. Is I suppose from the program that I'm managing, I'm trying to get across the importance of assessment and ideally coordination of retrofit, so that I suppose there is a degree of measurement and advice gone into it prior to people going ahead with retrofit. I get a lot of people that just feel like they want to engage with the builder and have their house retrofitted, but a lot of them, I suppose my first question to you is that, do you get many private homeowners, householders, whatever you want to call them, engaging with you with them not having an idea of what they want to achieve, other than they want to have a warmer home?
Yeah, the most common thing is, we want to fit a heat pump, is how the conversation starts. There's nothing on fabric in a lot of cases, and people, that's the most common starting point. So yes, people, at the end of the day, people only do this once, so they're bound to not know what to do. The important thing is to learn from others' experience, whether that's the experience of the contractor that's doing it or the designer. And I think that people assume it's going to be more straightforward. I'm sorry, I can't remember who it was who said it, but people assume it's going to be more straightforward than it actually is. And unfortunately, there's a stage that you go through that's this is going to be more complex than you think. And actually, that's something I have the advantage on doing, because if I say that to the client, the pressure's taken off the builder or whoever else has to break the bad news. I end up breaking the bad news to people quite often over what maybe the right approach is. So again, that's where something like an initial test prepares them for what the stages might be. But people don't know where to start, so people are sort of they're paralyzed into, do we do anything at all? And we have to get people, we've got to do something. So we've got to enable people to do it, get over that that stumbling block, and do whatever is appropriate for them, their building and their budget. That's what we've got to try and do.
Yeah, Yeah, well, that's my concern is it becomes too difficult, and therefore they do nothing. It's like that inertia kicks straight in.
And that's the key thing behind the ACB level 1 standard, that they've recognised that that's what's happening, that it becomes too fearful. And actually what we've got to do in terms of carbon, what we've got to do is recognise that the heating source is a key driver of the carbon use of that building, and offer that as a standard. And that's the background to why that's been introduced. So people can still get something to aim for. They can still get a badge of some kind on it, and it enables people to do something.
Okay, thank you.
Just a bit weary of time here, so
yeah, sorry.
Passing, no worries at all. We're passing on to Helen.
Right, let me hand over to you, Helen.
If you still have any questions in the meantime, if you want to pop them, if you're able to pop them in the chat, and then we can see if we can address them at the end.
Yeah, or if there's people can get in touch with me afterwards if that's.
I didn't want to offer that on your behalf, so
there you go. They can get in touch with me afterwards. There we go. Helen, over to you.
Thank you very much. Right, let me. Oh gosh, right, hang on. It's now asking me to amend my permissions. Hang on.
Okay, or is there anything else?
Yeah, no, it's the permissions, because I think it's recording, so it's asking me. There's a possibility that it may not record my screen, but obviously we'll share the slides afterwards, so everyone's got a copy of them. So yeah, sorry. Some issues. Remove this.
Any other questions in the meantime? Is there anything that?
Can I just make a comment?
Yes, feel free.
Yeah, it just came to me. I've recently joined the sort of network on women in properties, where it's like, but it doesn't matter if it's women. So what people, obviously people who invest in properties, they buy properties and then renovate them.
Yes.
But I doubt they have anything about putting air tightness or any level of insulation. They might do something for building regs if it's major here. But this sort of group of people, I don't know if it's a group of there's an opportunity lost to do it correctly, because then homeowners come and they want to improve, and that I'm sure you Diane seen lots of properties been recently renovated, and there's so many issues with air leakage. Is anything we can address? It's who is going to look after those properties in the first place?
The problem is, in that situation, it is down to the driver, is EPCs when it comes down to it, isn't it? That's the difficulty that we have, that the private rented sector, it's purely geared to EPC ratings, and so the airtightness side of it just doesn't come into it currently. So it's legislative framework and trying to make people more aware of what they're doing. I mean, I deal with sort of a few quite large private landlords, and they are more aware of it but in terms of the landlords that have, you know, relatively small numbers of properties, it's really difficult trying to inform them. But they don't pay the bills at the end of the day. That's the problem.
That's where it's all skewed.
Sorry?
That's where it's skewed. Private tenants are sitting ducks, and there's no incentive on the property owner to, broadly speaking, HHRS aside, invest.
Yeah.
There needs to be primary legislation, and it just so happens, without getting political, that half the cabinet are private landlords.
Yeah. On that note, we'll hand over to Helen. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, I think my screen, the slides are showing now, so fingers crossed we're all okay. So yeah, hi everybody. So I'm Helen. I work at Carbon Co-op on all things kind of research and evaluation. My background is I'm a human geographer, so I'm very interested in people and their experiences. So I've been asked to talk to you a little bit about kind of all the other things that kind of come into retrofit performance. And I don't really like, I put related because I don't like calling it the other stuff because that makes it sound less important. But I think, yeah, some of the stuff that I will cover is at the heart of the issue for a lot of householders. And so I think as a result of that, it's kind of stuff that we should care about too as professionals working in this space. So move on. Okay, so Diane touched on this a little bit. And those of you who are going through your retrofit coordinator training or have done that course will be familiar with this term. So I guess what are your intended outcomes, and what do we mean by that? So essentially, what outcomes would we like to see from the retrofit, all being well? And a well-planned retrofit process will include a conversation with the householder about those things at the beginning. Now, obviously, they could be very specific things. So obviously, you know, for one householder, it may be that they want to achieve a benefit, in which case, obviously, there's various targets that you need to meet in order to get that. But other intended outcomes can be quite broad. For example, you know, if a key priority is to improve comfort, then there's a lot of aspects within that. And so I'm kind of going to touch on some of those kind of more qualitative things, but also there are kind of quantitative ways that we can measure them as well. I guess one thing to say is by their very nature, a lot of these things are far more subjective, or as well, they involve wrangling with a lot more data points to determine whether we've kind of achieved it or not. And I guess the other thing I would say is this very much is the context for your retrofit project will shape these. So in particular, I'm thinking about if you're working on a scheme that is levering some public funding, so like home upgrade grants or social housing, if you're working in that sector, then there may well be intended outcomes that are linked to the funding criteria. Those may well be slightly different from the householders' intended outcomes as well. So we might have kind of slightly different priorities. And for that reason, I'd say it's really helpful and actually incredibly important to make a note of what you hope to achieve at the outset, because that will very much frame the kind of why, what, and how in terms of data. And then, yeah, so we've got a few things here: comfort, energy use, air quality, affordability, carbon and moisture, and then kind of health and well-being being this kind of overarching thing. So a lot of these things are very complementary to achieving that. Okay, so let's talk about comfort. I guess this is the ultimate one, very subjective. What's comfortable for me might not be comfortable for you, vice versa. But broadly speaking, comfort is affected by factors like internal temperature, but also air movement, noise, light, and it's also linked obviously to things like humidity, which I'll cover on another slide. So although we have got some kind of industry guidelines on daily average temperatures for comfort, so CIBSE in particular, I've got quite a lot of technical information in this area. I think we very much recognise that comfort is adaptive. So as humans, we're quite good at adapting to our environment. within reason, as long as we've got the time to do that and the opportunity to do that. So obviously improving the home is one way that we can help people to achieve that comfort. But obviously occupants have wide-ranging different physical responses to temperature and their own perceptions of comfort. I personally find my house comfortable at 18, but that's kind of a few degrees less than what a conventional internal temperature target would be, and what the models kind of assume. Variations in temperature obviously are also important. So small variations, so maybe like plus or minus a degree, we don't tend to notice. But when we start getting up to kind of like 2 degrees plus or minus, then that's when people start to notice things, and it can cause some complaint, obviously, when you get to the extremes. One thing which I think we don't talk about enough is surface temperatures. So they can have quite a big impact on comfort. You know, you'll know that yourself if you sat by a single glazed window in winter. You feel that cold from that surface. If you're on like sat by a north facing wall that's uninsulated. And then also around temperature, I think in retrofit we need to be taking things like overheating risk much more seriously. So obviously the length of time that temperatures are high is a thing that we need to be worried about. So when it becomes prolonged, chronic, that's when we really start to get negative effects on people, but also the severity of that temperature as well. So yeah, beyond a certain point, our bodies basically struggle to cope. Air movement, another important aspect of comfort. So that goes both ways. Obviously, cold drafts, not very pleasant, but air movement can help in summer. You know, the fan effect. It's not that the air is cooler, it's just that we're moving it around. And then other things as well, noise. It's rarely acknowledged, and I don't think it really drives a lot of retrofit design, but you can guarantee when you go back to speak to occupants that noise, if they've had triple glazing, is something that people always comment on first. It's like, gosh, the difference in noise, I can't hear the road at all anymore. Lighting, I'm not going to talk about that a lot because it's kind of not really, I don't consider like adding artificial lighting to be a kind of core measure, but natural light, a good amount of natural light obviously is good. It makes people feel good as well, but too much can be a bad thing, especially if we've got a lot of direct sunlight and the solar gains that are going to contribute to that. In terms of methods, simple questionnaires and surveys are a really good way to kind of baseline pre-retrofit condition and then return afterwards. So we tend to use quite a simple rating. We get people to rate their perception of comfort in terms of temperature and air movement, noise, light in kind of winter and summer. And then obviously repeating that afterwards can be really helpful to see if you've made a difference. But then obviously temperature, you can also start getting a bit more techie and quantitative with that. So you can monitor it through either, you know, very basic data loggers where you put them in for a short period of time, like a month, or you can get, you know, longer term monitoring systems as well. And then obviously things like thermal imaging cameras are also quite helpful for doing things like spot measurements, you know, looking at your surface temperature and things like that as well. So obviously health and well-being, comfort is definitely part of the puzzle linked to that. And factors like temperature obviously do have a bearing on health. This is the impact of cold homes is kind of enshrined now even in clinical care guidance. So there is that acknowledgement that cold homes can be really bad for our health. So I've got, you know, respiratory and heart, cardiovascular disease, but then there's also a lot of other things that we should care about, you know, like improving comfort and temperatures, you know, that it can have really far-ranging impacts. So the ability of a child to do their homework somewhere that is warm and comfortable, like that can't be understated. You know, people feeling isolated or not feeling able to invite people into their home because it's not a comfortable place to be, and other things like risks of trips and falls as well. So it's nice if we can capture some of these improvements when we come back to evaluate them. Comfort take back, I've put that on because I think it's important to acknowledge it's a thing. So this is the notion that some people take back the savings that they've achieved by a retrofit. So the home's less leaky now, so they can afford to heat it more than they were doing before. That might mean that they're using the same amount of energy or perhaps even more energy than they were, but they're actually achieving a better level of comfort. So we don't actually see those kind of savings. And I would argue that most of the time that's a good outcome. A lot of the time comfort take back rebound is framed quite negatively in terms of, and obviously, you know, energy demand reduction, we do want to see reductions in energy demand, but I think if a household is able to actually heat their home to a healthy and comfortable temperature, then that's a good thing. So obviously if we want to know whether that's happening, then we want to know what people are kind of doing around temperature before and after. And then we probably want to triangulate that by looking at their usage. So looking at the bill consumption data, and then maybe even some temperature monitoring data. I would say around questions around health and well-being. Obviously, there's a lot of variables that affect someone's sense of health and well-being, and retrofit that, but you know, there could be a lot of other confounding things. So I would say that if you do want to do surveys and things that try to capture some of that, like the wording is really important. And if you're working on like a social housing program or something like that, then maybe you can work with kind of engage with health professionals to feed in their expertise on that. Air quality. So obviously that's also linked to health and well-being. In terms of our homes, what we're generally talking around in terms of air quality issues are things like carbon dioxide, so CO2, VOCs, which are in pretty much everything in our homes, and they off gas for quite a long time. And then obviously particulates, so those large particles from things like wood burning stoves, also, you know, gas cookers as well. CO2 is kind of the dominant one, and it's kind of the one that you probably find it easiest to find bits of kit to help you monitor. It's a good proxy really for the level of kind of pollution in the air. In terms of building regs, there isn't actually a specific limit on CO2, but they do have a guideline level. So it's this 1,830 parts per million. So what we're interested in with CO2 is that cumulative build-up over a day, so an 8-hour average. In terms of kit to help you do that, there's some relatively inexpensive clamps you can get for kind of home monitoring systems. And there's also kind of proprietary systems like the one shown, that example is linked. I think that one in particular does like radon, CO2, VOCs, humidity temp, and other things linked to an app. Humidity and moisture, obviously this also is linked to comfort. So, you know, humidity can make us feel sticky or dry. I definitely feel it in winter when the central heating's on. I notice it affects your skin. Likewise, nobody really enjoys sitting. I don't enjoy sitting in this loft when it's hot. So obviously we've got kind of some generally accepted ranges for relative humidity. So kind of between 40 and 60%, but I think that the key thing to say there is it's not really hard and fast. So sometimes up to 70% might be okay. Below 40% might be comfortable in like a really cold period when the heating's on. But so what we're interested in really is those kind of higher levels of humidity over longer periods, which is why in things like Part F of the building regs, they're interested in kind of daily, weekly and monthly averages, because they're quite a good indicator of where you've got more risk of kind of things like mold formation. You can also ask some useful questions to occupants about this. So you can ask about their perceptions of air. We do that quite effectively with our householder questionnaires, and asking about clothes drying is also really useful context. You could also take on-the-spot readings. if you were doing an assessment, for example, or you could do, again, data loggers or longer term monitoring for this kind of thing. That's useful as well if you want to check how your ventilation improvements are doing. Obviously, if you've got prolonged periods of kind of higher humidity, or maybe you're seeing that the humidity is not, the peaks are not dropping that quickly, then it might indicate an issue that warrants some investigation. Energy bills, this is where we get into a bit of a minefield. Obviously this is affected by a lot of things. So the key one really that we want to probe in energy bills is the actual consumption, so the kilowatt hour figures. Because on top of that, we've also got to deal with things like standing charges, tariffs, different payment methods, discounts, credits. Maybe you're doing an Octopus Saver session, you get a rebate, what the weather's doing. Obviously, there's a lot of variables. So comparing someone's usage in pound terms before and after a retrofit is probably not going to tell you a great deal, because quite a lot of stuff could have happened in that time, none of which has to do with the actual work that you've completed. Feedback from householders about affordability. So sometimes we ask questions about how affordable they feel kind of it is to kind of heat and power their homes. They can be helpful, but obviously bear in mind all those other kind of contextual issues that may affect their satisfaction with that. So I think a lot of social housing schemes at the minute it's quite tricky, because a lot of those projects started before the massive energy price rises that we've had recently. It's helpful to have a comparison with energy modelled and actual bill data, because obviously an EPC model only looks at certain uses, so those regulated uses, so the fixed services and systems in a home. It doesn't include your plug loads. So if you're looking at a fuel bill figure from an EPC, it's not giving you that full picture. And then obviously there's other things that you may need to factor in as well around if there's any PV generation, diverted stored energy as well. Carbon, I'm putting a massive health warning on carbon. Obviously it's a big motivator for a lot of households, particularly those kind of early adopter households, and obviously it's a concern for organisations as well who work in this sector. But it can get quite complicated. So you can easily go down a bit of a rabbit hole and then feel lost. So there's kind of, broadly speaking, there's kind of operational carbon, so the carbon that we associate with heating, powering and cooling. Embodied carbon, so the carbon that's embedded in the materials that we're going to use. Whole life carbon talks about right away to the end of a product's life, so it being taken apart, a window being taken apart and being disposed of. So you can see how you can quickly fall down a rabbit hole and never come out again. Energy models can be useful for this, so they can give us kind of an indication of operational carbon, but just do bear in mind that the carbon figures that those models use can get out of date, so you're getting a snapshot of a point in time. It can take, whilst those carbon factors do get updated periodically, that does take time for it to filter through the system. So, it will take, might be reflective of what the grid was in maybe 2 years ago, but obviously our energy grid is changing quite dramatically. And the mix of renewable generation in our grid is, is increasing, but also it's probably more, fluctuates a lot more than it used to. So you can get into doing more dynamic carbon calculations, so using kind of more live figures. But obviously it's like the degree to which that detail is useful. And obviously forecasting what the carbon of the grid is going to look like in several years' time is very much like gazing into a crystal ball. So this is my last main points really. So I'd say that with all of this stuff, the devil's in the detail, but you don't always want to meet the devil. Like it's not always desirable to have a ton of data on this stuff. I mean, it's incredibly fascinating, especially to people like me who work in this all the time, but it's not always appropriate for the for the project in question. So really returning back to those intended outcomes. What does the client want to understand? And I would say that their priorities and needs should be the primary driver, really. Us as professionals, we may want to understand things in more detail, but not everyone does. So consider how you might balance that with their needs and expectations. Obviously, if you're putting in a more technical solution, that might be great for you and give you loads of interesting data, but if they find it really difficult to use and engage with themselves, then is it doing the job? I'd say indications for the house in the whole can be very helpful at confirming your assumptions. Averages are useful, I think. If you triangulate kind of your own observations, some occupant feedback and some data, that can be really helpful at just kind of joining the dots. So we kind of tend to take an approach that's based on, we look for outliers. It's kind of an error reporting approach. And certainly if you're dealing with any volume of homes in a programme, then you're just not going to be able to deal with looking at reams and reams of data per home. So it's useful for, you know, flagging things that warrant further investigation. Comparing what's reported and what's observed is useful. Obviously, relying on one thing alone isn't likely to give you that full picture. And then, yeah, if you are thinking about putting kit and sensors in, just consider what level of detail you need. Do you really need a sensor in every single room, or are you quite happy to use like one main reading from the living space? And yeah, just a general good principle is don't collect more data than you can cope with. Do you want snapshot or do you want to track change over time? This will all kind of shape your approach. And then I guess lastly, I would just say we all come with our own experiences and background, and that undoubtedly shapes what we do and how we interpret it. So it's not a bad thing, it's just something to be aware of as well. And that is it, I think. I've got some little links that may be useful, which we will send on in the slides. We got any questions?
Thank you.
Everyone drifted off to bed. Sorry, we are late.
Can I just raise a couple of sort of supplementary points, just building on what you've sort of just covered? On the carbon side, there's a RICS protocol that people that's sort of really formed the basis of the analysis, and you know it's broader than what the UK grid is doing. There's a whole certification structure for statements on carbon, and the big landlords are looking at it, and they're looking at archetypes. They pick a particular style of building, and they're looking at it simply because they see it as it's a threat from a business point of view. So bear that in mind when you're looking at work with, when you're looking at, for example, private landlords, they will start to, I mean, the ones I'm dealing with, we're talking about hundreds or thousands of properties that they own. So bear that in mind. It will cascade down the chain. The other thing,
when you said big landlords, you mentioned private. What about social landlords?
I think the driver there is EPCs, really, primarily. The private landlords are basically seeing it as a threat, a business threat, because what they're going to have is stranded assets. In effect, it's going to cost more potentially. What they're trying to do is assess how much it's going to cost in terms of compliance, and how that relates to the value of that asset is how they're assessing it currently. So and I mean, some of the work that we've been doing, hopefully it will be published before too long, but very high profile large landowners, the largest landowners in the UK, basically. So yeah, I think it's going to become more a high profile, really. It's a good career move, let me put it that way, probably. The other thing I'd just like to mention is ventilation, which just don't assume that what you've put in is performing as it should do. I I do a reasonable amount on ventilation, and the most common thing I come across is standard extract fans that are fitted on long tubes that perform nowhere near as well as they should do. So we don't underestimate just checking the flow rates on things that are being installed, that they are actually correct and performing as they should do, because that is something that often trips people up.
Can I just add something to what Simeon said about social landlords? And we sort of said that one of the drivers there is like EPC C. I think it's probably a little bit bigger than that, in particular with local authorities, because what you tend to find is that local authorities, as an organisation, are signing up to a commitment in terms of carbon by a certain date. So obviously, whatever they're doing in respect to the profit side of things, that is just one contribution within the other elements that they do within the organisation. And if they can overachieve on a C, it sort of like helps achieving on what their overall targets are as well. So just want to bear in mind.
Realise we have gone over time, but we definitely appreciate everyone sticking around. Is there any further questions before we close up?
Are you collecting some, obviously you can do a lot of information from occupancy assessment. Is it going to be freely available to the people to understand what doesn't work from your side? Thank you.
Who's the question aimed at? That
You mean the kind of household questionnaires, that kind of thing?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, so there's stuff that we kind of adapt. I mean, I have like a kind of solid set of questions that I use, and then we kind of adapt them for each project. There is, in terms of like at an industry level, there is a British standard for building performance evaluation, and that has some stuff in around core things that should be collected. So there's a survey that I can send a link to called SOAP Retrofit Survey. So that's an example of one kind of occupancy survey, and that the person that runs that survey kind of, when we share the results, kind of benchmarks the property that you've got the response for against the data set. So that's quite useful. What I would say is it's quite a long survey, so it might not be appropriate for every circumstance, but it's a good solid set of questions, really. There's other things as well. So there's that building user survey that's run by Arup, but there's kind of costs involved with that. But yeah, I think that like doing a good survey it's not always easy to ask the questions, in that like you can quite easily lead people with your questions. So yeah, it's useful, I think, to maybe look at some things like the SOAP survey, so that just to make sure you're not doing that, because you don't want to skew your responses.
Helen, would you mind putting a link into?
Yeah, I will. I'll just show it now. I've just found it. So it's Zach. Oh no, hang on, I just sent that directly to Diane. Let me send it to the chat. So it's that one.
Right.
But there's some other resources that I can signpost you at as well. The one that we use on most of our projects is not that long, and I've done some as well for social housing, decarbonisation fund schemes, and obviously with that it was you know, as light touch as possible, really, because the engagement aspect of those projects can sometimes be quite difficult to resource. So you don't want to like drown people in evaluation. Very conscious of not doing that.
Are there any other questions, thoughts? We will be sending out the recording for both the webinars, even if you didn't make the last one, and we'll be sending out the slides to everyone as well. But a big thank you to Helen, Diane and John. And thanks for everyone attending. Any further questions, you can still email us at training@retrofit.coop. I'll pop the email address in the chat as well.